My name is Edmund Harrington, and for 3 years, I lived like a ghost in my own home. The Harrington estate stretched across 2,000 acres of prime Alabama cottonland, but all that wealth and grandeur meant nothing to me after the fever took my family. My wife Catherine, my son James, who was only 6, and little Mary, who had just learned to walk, all of them buried in the family cemetery within the span of 2 terrible weeks. In the summer of 1855, the mansion that had once echoed with children's laughter and Catherine's gentle humming now stood silent as a tomb. I moved through its halls like a man underwater, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. The cotton still grew, the business still ran, but only because my overseer Samuel Jenkins and the house staff kept everything functioning. While I retreated into my study with ledgers and bourbon, I barely noticed the people who worked in my house, the enslaved men and women who cleaned, cooked, and maintained the facade of Southern gentility that I no longer cared about. They moved around me like shadows, and I preferred it that way. Human connection meant the possibility of loss, and I had already lost everything that mattered. That changed on a cold February morning in 1858 when I collapsed in my study from what Dr. Whitfield later diagnosed as exhaustion and malnutrition. I had been living on whiskey and whatever scraps the cook left outside my door, refusing to join the world of the living, even for something as basic as a proper meal. I awoke 3 days later in my own bed, weak as a newborn but with a fever that had finally broken. Sitting in the chair beside my bed was a young woman I had never really looked at before, though she had been working in my house for over a year. She was reading aloud from a book, Dickens, I realized with surprise, her voice soft and melodious, with an accent that spoke of education rather than field work. When she noticed I was awake, she set the book aside and smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had seen directed at me since before my family died, and it hit me with unexpected force. "Mr. Edmund," she said, her voice warm with relief. "Dr. Whitfield said you'd be waking up soon. How are you feeling?" I tried to speak but found my throat parched. She immediately reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, helping me sit up enough to drink. Her hands were gentle but strong, and I noticed they were uncalloused, not the hands of a field worker. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out. "Clara, sir. I've been taking care of the house since Mrs. Catherine ... double quotes. She paused delicately. "I've been here a while now." Clara. The name stirred a vague memory. Jenkins mentioning hiring additional house staff. Something about a woman who had belonged to the Patterson estate before they lost their fortune gambling. But I had been so deep in my grief that I hadn't paid attention to such details. "You were reading," I observed, my voice still rough. A flash of fear crossed her features, quickly suppressed. "Yes, sir. I thought you might like to hear something while you recovered. Mrs. Catherine used to read to you sometimes, didn't she?" The mention of my wife should have sent me back into the darkness, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps because Clara had spoken of Catherine with such gentle respect, or perhaps because I was too weak to sustain the weight of grief that had been crushing me for 3 years. "How do you know how to read?" I asked. Clara's hands twisted in her lap, and I could see her calculating how much truth was safe to tell. "Mrs. Patterson taught me before the estate was sold. She said every person should know letters, regardless of their station. It was a dangerous admission. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Alabama, punishable by fines and imprisonment. But something in Clara's careful dignity, in the way she had cared for me during my illness, made me feel protective rather than concerned about legal infractions. "What else did Mrs. Patterson teach you?" I asked. "Numbers, sir, and some French. She said I had a mind for learning." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was confessing to a crime. Which, technically she was. I studied. Her face really looked at her for the first time. Clara was beautiful in an understated way, with intelligent dark eyes and features that spoke of mixed heritage. Her hair was pulled back simply, but I could see it had a natural wave that caught the morning light streaming through my bedroom windows. She carried herself with a quiet grace that suggested she had been raised in a household very different from a typical plantation. "How long have you been taking care of me?" I asked. 3 days, sir. Dr. Whitfield said someone needed to watch over you. Make sure you took fluids and medicine. Jenkins asked if I could. She trailed off, perhaps realizing that explaining the arrangement might reveal how little attention I had been paying to my own household. "And you've been reading to me the whole time?" "Most of it, yes, sir. I thought you might hear, even if you weren't awake. Sometimes people do." There was something in her voice, a gentleness that spoke of genuine caring rather than mere duty. When was the last time someone had cared whether I lived or died? When was the last time I had cared myself? "What were you reading?" "A Tale of Two Cities, sir. It's about—" She hesitated, as if unsure whether I wanted her to continue talking. "I know what it's about," I said, not unkindly. "It was one of my wife's favorites. She read it to me when it was first published." "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories. I can read something else, or—" "No," I said, surprising myself. "Continue with Dickens, but start from the beginning. I'd like to hear the whole story." Relief flooded her features. "Yes, sir. Would you like some soup first?" "Cook made chicken broth, and Dr. Whitfield said you need to build your strength back up." As Clara left to fetch the soup, I found myself actually looking forward to something for the first time in 3 years. Not just the story, though I was curious to hear how she would interpret Dickens's complex narrative, but to the sound of another human voice, to the presence of someone who seemed to genuinely care about my welfare. When she returned with a tray of soup and fresh bread, I noticed details about her that my grief-numbed mind had missed before. She moved with efficiency, but without hurry, arranged things on the bedside table with an attention to order that spoke of pride in her work. When she helped me sit up to eat, her touch was professional but kind. "Clara," I said as she settled back into her chair with the book, "how old are you?" 24, sir. "And you've been at the Patterson place your whole life?" "Since I was 7, sir. My mother was sold when the plantation where I was born got into debt. Mrs. Patterson bought us both, but my mother died of fever my first winter there." She spoke matter-of-factly, but I could hear the old pain beneath her words. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, and meant it. She looked at me with surprise, as if kindness from a master was unexpected. "Thank you, sir. Mrs. Patterson was good to me after that. She said my mother had been intelligent, and she wanted to honor her memory by making sure I had opportunities to learn. And now you're here." "Yes, sir." When the Patterson estate was sold to pay debts, Jenkins bought my papers along with some of the household furnishings. He said you needed reliable house staff. There was so much packed into that simple statement. The casual way human beings were bought and sold like furniture. The disruption of having your entire world dissolve to pay someone else's gambling debts, the uncertainty of being purchased by strangers who might treat you well or terribly. "Are you ... I struggled with how to phrase the question. "Are you content here?" Clara's eyes widened slightly, and I realized it was probably the first time in her life that anyone had asked her opinion about her circumstances. "The house is beautiful, sir, and the work isn't hard. Everyone has been kind to me." She paused, then added quietly, "And taking care of someone who's hurting, it feels like something worth doing." The simple honesty of her answer hit me harder than any elaborate sympathy speech could have. Here was a woman who had every reason to be bitter, torn from her home, sold like property, tasked with caring for a master who had barely acknowledged her existence. And yet she spoke of finding purpose in easing another person's pain. "Read," I said, settling back against my pillows. "Start from It Was the Best of Times." As Clara's voice filled the quiet room, Reading Dickens's famous opening with careful pronunciation and evident understanding of the text, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years, a moment of peace. Not happiness, that still seemed as distant as the moon, but a simple absence of the crushing weight that had been my constant companion. For the first time since the fever took my family, I wasn't counting the hours until I could lose myself in sleep or whiskey. I was listening to a story, told by someone whose own story was just beginning to interest me, and feeling almost grateful to be alive. It was a small thing, perhaps, but after 3 years of darkness, any light was a miracle. As Clara read about revolution and redemption, about love surviving in impossible circumstances, I found myself wondering about the woman whose voice was bringing these words to life. What did she think about when she wasn't caring for broken masters? What dreams did she harbor? What did the world look like through her eyes? These were dangerous questions for a Southern gentleman to ask about an enslaved woman. But as I lay there listening to her read about the possibility of resurrection and new life, I couldn't bring myself to care about danger for the first time. In 3 years, I was curious about something other than my own grief, and that, I would later realize, was the beginning of everything. Recovery came slowly, but for the first time since my losses, I wanted to get better. Clara tended to me with a competence that spoke of natural intelligence rather than mere training. She seemed to anticipate my needs before I voiced them, adjusting pillows without being asked, bringing meals at times when I was most likely to have an appetite, reading when conversation felt too taxing, and talking when silence became oppressive. As my strength returned, I found myself paying attention to details about Clara that revealed the depth of her character. She never complained about the long hours of sitting with an invalid, never showed impatience when I had difficulty eating, or became irritable from pain. Most remarkably, she treated my grief with a respect that most people couldn't manage, acknowledging my loss without trying to rush me past it or minimize its impact. "Mr. Edmund," she said one afternoon as I sat by the window for the first time in weeks, "would you like me to read something different today? Perhaps some poetry?" Mrs. Catherine had a beautiful collection. The suggestion should have been painful. Catherine's books were among the things I'd avoided since her death. But Clara's gentle way of mentioning my wife, as if Catherine were still a presence worthy of honor rather than a source of unbearable pain, made the idea bearable. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "I've been reading some of Mrs. Catherine's. Wordsworth. There's one about daffodils that seems fitting for spring." She gestured toward the window where the first flowers were beginning to appear in Catherine's garden, a garden that had been maintained by the groundskeepers, despite my neglect. "You tend to think about what's fitting," I observed, "about what might help rather than what might be easier." Clara paused in arranging the books on the table beside my chair. "I suppose I do, sir. Mama used to say that if you're going to be somewhere, you might as well try to make it better than you found it. Wise woman, your mother. She was, sir. She used to tell me stories about the place where she grew up, before she was sold the first time. She said there were people there who believed everyone had something valuable to contribute, regardless of their station. That God made every person with gifts meant to be shared." I studied Clara's profile as she spoke about her mother. There was a strength in her bearing, a quiet confidence that seemed almost defiant given her circumstances. She spoke of profound loss with the same calm acceptance she brought to everything else. But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't resignation. It was a kind of courage. "Do you believe that?" I asked. "About everyone having gifts?" "I do, sir." She looked at me directly then, and I saw something in her eyes that made my breath catch. "I think you have gifts too, Mr. Edmund. I can see them, even if you can't right now." What gifts could a man like me possibly have? The question came out more bitter than I intended. "You're kind, sir. Even in your grief, you're kind. You ask about my mother. You thank me for reading. You care about whether the work is hard for me. That matters more than you might think." The simple words hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had seen anything worthwhile in me? When was the last time I had seen anything worthwhile in myself? "Clara," I said carefully, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sir. Do you have a husband? A family of your own?" A shadow crossed her features. "No, sir. There was someone at the Patterson place. Joseph, the stable master's son. We cared for each other. But when the estate was sold, he was bought by a plantation in Mississippi. I don't know if I'll ever see him again." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of having the person she loved sold away from her, as if this were simply another unavoidable tragedy like weather or disease, made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," I said. "That must have been ... heartbreaking," she finished quietly. "Yes, sir, it was. But I learned that you can survive heartbreak if you have to. You find ways to carry the love without letting the loss destroy you." She was looking at me with understanding that went beyond her years, and I realized she was talking about more than her own loss. She was talking about mine, about the choice between carrying love or being destroyed by loss. "How?" I asked. "How do you carry love without being destroyed?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think about what Joseph would want for me. Would he want me to stop caring about people? Would he want me to stop finding beauty in small things? Would he want me to become bitter and closed off from the world?" She shook her head. "He'd want me to keep living, really living. To honor what we had by not letting it make me afraid. To care again." The wisdom in her words was both simple and profound. Here was a woman who had every reason to become hard and cynical, who had lost everything and everyone she cared about, and yet she had chosen to remain open, to keep caring, to keep believing in the possibility of goodness. "You're remarkable," I said without thinking. Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Sir? You're remarkable," I repeated. "Your strength, your wisdom, your capacity for kindness despite everything you've endured. I've known senators and judges and businessmen who couldn't match your character." Color rose in her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands. "You're very kind to say so, sir. I'm not being kind. I'm being honest, perhaps for the first time in years." That evening, as Clara read Wordsworth's poetry in the fading light, I found myself watching her face instead of looking out the window. She read with genuine appreciation for the language, pausing at particularly beautiful passages, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verse. When she came to the lines about daffodils bringing joy to the heart in solitude, her eyes met mine briefly, and I saw in them a hope that maybe, eventually, joy might return to my life too. After she finished reading and left to prepare for the night, I remained in my chair thinking about our conversation. Clara had lost her mother, her home, her lover, her freedom, essentially everything a person could lose, and yet she had emerged with her humanity not just intact but refined, purified into something approaching wisdom. I, who had lost terribly, but still possessed wealth, status, and freedom, had responded by retreating from life entirely. Which of us had shown more strength? Which of us had honored our losses better? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I asked Clara to join me for breakfast. "Sir?" she said, clearly uncertain she had heard correctly. "I've been thinking about what you said, about everyone having gifts. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts, and it seems foolish for you to stand while I sit, for you to wait while I eat. Would you join me?" The request was scandalous by any measure of Southern propriety. Masters didn't share meals with enslaved people, didn't seek their opinions as equals, didn't blur the careful lines that maintained social order. But sitting in my dining room, watching Clara's surprise give way to cautious pleasure, I found I didn't care about propriety. "I'd be honored, Mr. Edmund," she said quietly, as we shared a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits. talking about books and ideas and the small observations of daily life. I felt more like myself than I had since before the fever took my family. Not the self I had been, that man was gone forever, but a new self, one informed by loss but not defined by it. That Clara had begun the work of bringing me back to life, but I was starting to understand that the process was changing me in ways that went far beyond simple recovery. She was teaching me to see the world through different eyes, to value different things, to question assumptions I had never thought to examine. It was dangerous territory for a Southern gentleman, but as I watched Clara's face light up when discussing a particularly beautiful passage from Emerson, I realized that some kinds of danger might be worth the risk. The woman sitting across from me, sharing thoughts that revealed a mind of startling depth and sensitivity, was making me want to be a better man than I had ever been. And for the first time in 3 years, that seemed like a goal worth pursuing. What I didn't yet understand was how completely that goal would transform not just my life, but my entire understanding of what life could be. By late spring, Clara and I had fallen into a routine that would have scandalized anyone who witnessed it. We took breakfast together each morning, during which we discussed whatever book she was reading aloud to me. Afternoons were spent walking the estate grounds while she helped me rebuild my physical strength, and evenings found us in the library, reading and talking until well past the time when proper boundaries should have reasserted themselves. I told myself I was simply grateful for intelligent conversation, that I was merely appreciating Clara's exceptional character and education. But the truth was more complicated and far more dangerous. Somewhere between her careful nursing and our deepening conversations, gratitude had evolved into something that felt suspiciously like affection. Clara, for her part, maintained perfect propriety in her manner while somehow managing to challenge every assumption I held about intelligence, character, and human worth. She never overstepped the boundaries of her position, but she also never diminished herself to fit those boundaries. It was a delicate balance that spoke to both her wisdom and her courage. The morning everything changed began with Clara bringing news that Confederate forces had captured a Union supply train heading north through Alabama. The war that had seemed distant from our isolated estate suddenly felt immediate and personal. "Mr. Edmund," she said as she set down my coffee, "there's talk in the quarters about what this might mean. Some of the field hands are saying that if the Union Army gets close enough—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Enslaved people throughout the South were listening for news of Union advances, hoping for liberation that might come with the Northern Army. "What do you think about the war, Clara?" I asked. She looked at me carefully, clearly weighing how honest she could afford to be. "I think any war that might end slavery is a war worth fighting, sir, even if it brings hardship and uncertainty." The statement was treasonous by Confederate standards, but it was also honest in a way that I had come to expect from Clara. She didn't dissemble or tell me what she thought I wanted to hear. She spoke her truth and trusted me to respond with dignity. "And what about the hardship it might bring to people like me?" I asked. "Men whose entire livelihood depends on the system the Union wants to destroy?" "I think, sir, that any system built on other people's suffering was never going to last forever. And I think men like you, men with intelligence and character, will find ways to build new lives that don't require other people's bondage." Her faith in my character was both humbling and inspiring. Here was a woman who had every reason to hate men like me, who had been bought and sold like livestock, and yet she believed I was capable of moral growth and positive change. "Clara," I said carefully, "if you could be free, truly free, not just legally but practically, what would you do with your life?" Her eyes lit up with a hope so pure it nearly broke my heart. "I'd want to teach, sir, reading and writing and numbers, to children who have never had the chance to learn. I'd want to help people understand that education is the key to real freedom." "You'd make an excellent teacher," I said, and meant it. You've certainly taught me more in the past few months than I learned in years before. What have I taught you, sir? I considered the question seriously. You've taught me that character has nothing to do with the circumstances of birth. You've taught me that strength isn't about avoiding pain, but about continuing to care despite it. You've taught me that intelligence and wisdom can flourish anywhere, if they're given the chance. Clara's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment, but her next words surprised me. And you've taught me something too, Mr. Edmund. What's that? You've taught me that kindness isn't weakness, and that some white folks really can see past skin color to the person underneath. You've shown me that friendship is possible even across the line society draws. Friendship. The word hung in the air between us, both accurate and insufficient. What I felt for Clara had evolved far beyond friendship, though I hadn't allowed myself to examine those feelings too closely. That afternoon, as we walked through Catherine's rose garden, Clara made an observation that forced me to confront the truth of my feelings. Mrs. Catherine must have loved these roses, she said, touching the petals of a bloom that had somehow survived 3 years of my neglect. I can see her in them, graceful and beautiful and carefully tended. Yes, I agreed. She spent hours out here. Said gardening connected her to something larger than herself. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was. I paused, then added something I hadn't said to anyone before. But she was also limited by her time and place. Catherine never questioned the system we lived in, never wondered whether it was right or wrong. She was kind to the house servants, but she never considered that they might be equals deserving of freedom. Clara looked at me with surprise. And? You do? Consider that, I mean. How could I not, after knowing you? The words came out before I could stop them, charged with more emotion than I had intended. We stood there among the roses, the weight of my admission settling between us. Clara's eyes searched my face, and I saw in them a reflection of my own confusion and longing. Mr. Edmund, she said softly, what are you saying? I could have retreated then, could have claimed I was simply speaking philosophically about human dignity. Instead, I chose honesty. I'm saying that somewhere in the past few months, you've become more important to me than anyone has been since Catherine died. I'm saying that when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it. And I'm saying that I've come to care about your happiness more than my own reputation or social standing. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought I had frightened her or offended her. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund, you have to understand what you're saying, what you're suggesting. The danger of it, not just to your position, but to both our lives. I understand the danger, I said, moving closer to her among the roses. But I also understand that I've spent 3 years feeling dead inside, and you've brought me back to life. I understand that I've never known anyone with your strength and wisdom and goodness. And I understand that what I feel for you is real and pure and worth any risk, even if it means losing everything. Your estate, your position, your place in society. What place in society? I asked. I've been hiding from society for 3 years. As for the estate, I gestured around us at the acres of cotton and the fine house in the distance. What good is wealth built on other people's suffering? What value does property have that requires me to treat you as less than human? Clara was crying openly now, but her tears seemed to be of relief rather than sorrow. I never let myself hope that you might see me as ... As what? As a woman worthy of love rather than just service. I took her hands then, there among Catherine's roses, and spoke the truth that had been growing in my heart. For months, Clara, you're not just worthy of love. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Your intelligence, your strength, your capacity for forgiveness and growth, you're everything I never knew I was looking for. And you, she sighed, squeezing my hands, have shown me that love doesn't have to be limited by the line society draws. That someone can see past everything I'm supposed to be and value who I actually am. We kissed then, softly and carefully, as if we were both afraid the moment might shatter if we moved too quickly. When we finally pulled apart, I saw in Clara's eyes the same mixture of joy and terror that I felt in my own heart. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we decide whether we're brave enough to choose love over everything else," I said. "Whether we're willing to build something new and true, regardless of what the world thinks of us." "It won't be easy," Clara warned. "People will hate us for it. They'll try to destroy us." "Probably," I agreed. "But the alternative is living. A lie, pretending not to feel what we feel, denying the best thing that's happened to either of us. I've spent 3 years dying slowly from grief and isolation. I won't spend the rest of my life dying slowly from cowardice." Clara smiled then. The radiant smile that had first caught my attention months ago, now directed at me with all the love and hope she had been hiding. "Then we choose love," she said simply, "and we face whatever comes together." Standing in that garden where my first wife had once found peace, holding the hands of a woman who had taught me to live again, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the fever: complete and perfect happiness. It was dangerous and scandalous and likely to bring down the wrath of everyone I had ever known. It was also the most right thing I had ever done. As we walked back to the house hand in hand, I began planning how to protect the woman I loved and build a life worthy of what she had given me. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the future rather than hiding from it. Clara had saved my life in more ways than one. Now it was time for me to prove worthy of that salvation. The transformation of my feelings for Clara from gratitude to love had happened so gradually that I barely noticed it until it was complete. But once I acknowledged the truth of what I felt, I became a man possessed by a single purpose: ensuring that Clara could live as the remarkable woman she was, not as the property society said she must remain. The first step was legal and complicated. In the summer of 1858, I quietly began the process of manumission, preparing documents that would legally free Clara from bondage. It was a complex procedure in Alabama, requiring approval from local courts and proof that the freed person could support themselves. But I had connections and resources, and more importantly, I had absolute determination. "Edmund," Clara said one evening as we sat in the library, "you've been different lately. Distracted. Is something troubling you?" I set down the legal papers I had been reviewing and looked at the woman who had become the center of my world. Over the months since our first kiss, we had continued meeting privately, our relationship deepening into something that felt both natural and revolutionary. Clara had moved from her quarters into the main house, ostensibly as my personal housekeeper, but actually as my partner in all but name. "I've been preparing something," I said. "Something that will change everything for us." "What kind of something?" "Your freedom papers. Legal manumission that will make you a free woman in the eyes of the law." Clara's eyes widened, and the book in her hands trembled. "Edmund, you can't be serious." "The cost alone. The cost is irrelevant. What's relevant is that I refuse to love a woman who exists as my property. I refuse to build a relationship on a foundation of ownership rather than equality. But people will ask questions. They'll want to know why you freed me, what your intentions are." "Let them ask," I said firmly. "I'm tired of living my life based on other people's expectations and prejudices. I want to live it based on what I know to be right." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications of what I was proposing. Finally, she spoke. "If I'm free, truly free, then what happens between us? What happens to this?" She gestured between us, encompassing the love that had grown in the quiet spaces of our hidden relationship. "That depends on whether you'll have me," I said. "Whether you'd be willing to marry a man whose reputation will be destroyed by his choice to love you." "Marry?" Clara's voice was barely audible. I know it's complicated. I know there are states where interracial marriage is illegal, where we'd face imprisonment or worse. But there are also places where we could be legally wed, where we could live as husband and wife without fear. And you'd be willing to leave everything for that? Your home, your business, your entire life? I moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in mine. Clara, you are my life now. Everything else is just ... things, property, social position. None of it means anything compared to the chance to spend my days with you, to build something real and honest and good. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling through them. Edmund, do you understand what you're asking? Not just of me, but of yourself? Once we do this, there's no going back. You can't change your mind and return to being a respectable Southern gentleman. I don't want to be a respectable Southern gentleman if it means living without you. I want to be a man worthy of your love, worthy of your trust, worthy of the life you've given back to me. Then yes, she whispered. Yes to freedom, yes to marriage, yes to whatever life we can build together. The legal process took 3 months, during which I also began quietly liquidating assets and preparing for our departure from Alabama. Sold most of the cotton crop early, converted property holdings to cash and bonds that could be transported easily, and made arrangements with business contacts in Ohio who could help us establish a new life in a state where interracial marriage was legal. The hardest part was deciding what to do about the other enslaved people on my plantation. I couldn't free them all without arousing immediate suspicion, but I also couldn't simply abandon them to whatever master might buy the estate after my departure. Clara, as always, provided the solution. What if you sold the plantation to someone who would treat them well, she suggested. Someone who shares your evolving views about slavery? It took weeks of careful inquiry, but I eventually found such a buyer, Marcus Whitney, a transplanted northerner who had come south to run a textile mill and who privately opposed slavery but had been afraid to act on his convictions. When I explained my situation, he agreed to purchase the estate and gradually manumit the enslaved families over time, helping them establish independent lives as free laborers or small farmers. On a crisp October morning, Clara and I stood before a justice of the peace in Cincinnati, Ohio, exchanging vows that made us husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Clara wore a simple blue dress that I had bought for her, and I wore my best suit, but we both felt dressed in dignity and hope. Do you, Edmund Harrington, take Clara to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish, for better or worse in sickness and health, as long as you both shall live? I do, I said, looking into Clara's eyes and seeing my entire future there. Do you, Clara, take Edmund to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish, for better or worse in sickness and health, as long as you both shall live? I do, she said, her voice strong and clear. As we kissed to seal our union, I felt a completion that I had never experienced before. Not even my first marriage, loving as it had been, had felt this significant. This was a choice made in full understanding of its consequences, a love built on equality and mutual respect rather than social convention. Our wedding night was spent in a small hotel in Cincinnati, talking and planning and marveling at the reality of our situation. We were legally married, legally free to build a life together, legally able to love each other without fear of prosecution or social retribution. Mrs. Harrington, I said as we lay together in the darkness, Clara's head on my shoulder. I like the sound of that, she murmured. Though it still seems almost impossible to believe. What seems impossible? That I went from being property to being a wife. That I went from having no control over my life to being an equal partner in marriage. That you saw past everything society said I was to who I actually am. You were never property, Clara. You were always a remarkable woman who deserved freedom and love and respect. Society was simply too blind to see it. We established ourselves in a small town outside Cincinnati, where I invested our resources in a modest farm and a business venture that aligned with Clara's dreams, a school for freed slaves and their children. Clara's vision of education as the key to true freedom became the foundation of our new life together. The school started small. Just a few families who had made their way north seeking education for their children. But Clara's reputation as a teacher spread quickly through the community of former slaves. And within a year we had more than 30 students ranging in age from 6 to 60, watching Clara in her element, teaching reading and arithmetic to people who had been denied education their entire lives. I understood that this was what she had been meant to do. Her patience was infinite, her methods innovative, and her belief in her students' potential was absolute. She treated every breakthrough, a child reading their first sentence, an adult writing their own name, as a miracle worth celebrating. Edmund, she said one evening as we reviewed the school's accounts, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, my dear?" "Your estate in Alabama, the money from the sale. I know you used most of it to establish us here, but there's still quite a bit left." "Yes, there is. What are you thinking?" Clara looked at me with the expression I had learned meant she was about to propose something both ambitious and necessary. "I think we should use it to buy freedom for as many enslaved people as possible. Help them come north, help them get education and training, help them build independent lives." The proposal was exactly what I should have expected from Clara: generous, practical, and focused on using our resources to maximum humanitarian effect. It was also dangerous, likely to draw unwanted attention from authorities both north and south. "It would be risky," I said carefully. "Helping enslaved people escape, even through legal purchase, could make us targets for bounty hunters and southern vigilantes." "I know," Clara said. "But Edmund, we have advantages that most people fighting slavery don't have. We have money, we have knowledge of how the system works, and we have the credibility that comes with your background. If we don't use those advantages to help others, what's the point of having them?" She was right, of course. We had been blessed with resources and opportunity that could make a real difference in other people's lives. To hoard those blessings for our own security would be a betrayal of everything our love represented. "Then we'll do it," I said. "We'll help as many people as we can." Over the next 2 years, we developed a network that purchased enslaved people from willing sellers and transported them north to freedom. We worked with abolitionists, Underground Railroad conductors, and sympathetic merchants to create a pipeline that brought dozens of families to safety. Each arrival at our farm was a celebration. Clara would gather the children to meet their new classmates. I would help the adults find work and housing, and together we would watch people discover what it meant to live as free human beings. One afternoon in the spring of 1861, as news of Fort Sumter and the official beginning of the Civil War reached our community, Clara and I sat on our porch watching a group of children play in the yard of our school. Former slaves' children and white children from sympathetic families played together without any awareness that the color of their skin was supposed to matter. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Giving up everything you had in Alabama for this life?" I considered the question seriously. We lived modestly compared to my previous wealth. Our house was comfortable but small, our social circle was limited to fellow abolitionists and educators, and we faced constant low-level hostility from people who disapproved of our marriage and our cause. But as I looked at Clara, my wife, my partner, my dearest friend, and at the thriving school that had grown from her dreams, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything my previous life had offered. "Regret it?" I said. "Clara, marrying you and building this life with you is the best thing I've ever done. You saved me from grief and gave me purpose. You taught me what love really means and what it means to live according to conscience rather than convention. And you," she said, taking my hand, "gave me freedom and equality and the chance to use my gifts for something meaningful." You saw me as a person when the world said I was property. You chose love over safety, justice over comfort. We chose, I corrected. We chose together. As the war raged in the South, we continued our work in Ohio. Our school grew, our network helped more families reach freedom, and our marriage deepened into something that felt both revolutionary and perfectly natural. We faced challenges, financial pressures, social disapproval, occasional threats from pro-slavery sympathizers, but we faced them together. When news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached us in 1863, Clara and I held each other and wept. The system that had once owned her, that had defined her as property, was finally beginning to crumble. "It's ending," she whispered. "The whole terrible system is finally ending. Because of people like you," I said. People who refused to accept that the color of their skin determined their worth, who insisted on their humanity even when the world denied it. After the war ended, we received a letter from Marcus Whitney, the man who had bought my Alabama estate. He wrote to tell us that he had successfully freed all the remaining enslaved families and helped them establish independent farms on what had once been plantation land. Several families had specifically asked him to thank Mr. Edmund and Miss Clara for making their freedom possible. That letter, more than any recognition or reward, felt like validation of the choices we had made. As I write this, Clara and I have been married for 7 years. Our school now serves more than 100 students, and Clara has trained a dozen other teachers who have gone on to establish schools throughout Ohio and beyond. I've become something I never expected to be, a businessman whose success is measured not in cotton bales or property values, but in the number of people we've helped achieve education and independence. Sometimes in quiet moments, I think about the man I was before the fever took my first family, wealthy, respected, unthinking in my acceptance of slavery as natural and inevitable. That man seems like a stranger to me now. The grief that nearly destroyed me ultimately became the crack that let light into my soul, and Clara was the light that transformed everything. I gave Clara my estate, but she gave me something far more valuable. She gave me back my humanity, my capacity for growth, my ability to love without reservation. She taught me that true wealth isn't measured in property or social standing, but in the depth of our connections and the positive impact we have on other people's lives. Our love story began with a plantation mistress inheriting human property. It ended with 2 equal partners using their freedom to help others achieve theirs. We lost a fortune built on suffering and found a wealth based on service, love, and the revolutionary idea that all people, regardless of race or status, deserve dignity, education, and the chance to choose their own destinies. In a world that said our love was impossible, we proved that love is the most possible thing of all. In a society that said our marriage was wrong, we built a life that felt more right than anything either of us had ever known. And in giving Clara her freedom, I discovered my own. That, I have learned, is how love really works. It liberates not just the beloved, but the one who loves. It doesn't diminish us when we give it freely. It multiplies, creating more joy, more purpose, more meaning than we ever thought possible. Clara and I didn't just find love despite the circumstances that should have kept us apart. We found a love that was made stronger, deeper, and more meaningful precisely because we had to choose it over everything else society offered us. And that choice, renewed every day for 7 years and counting, remains the best decision I have ever made.